Welcome to Sobol Says for Parshas Vayigash. We are now continuing the story that was actually interrupted midway last week. As we completed the Parsha, it actually ended what was in the middle of a very dramatic moment. At this point, the brothers, the Shvatim, have all been accused by Yosef. They were all gathered together and searched for his missing goblet, his divining cup that was planted on them, actually planted in Binyamin's knapsack. And now they have been discovered and they have been hauled back to the palace to stand in front of Yosef. And of course, the beginning of the Parsha is now where Yehuda approaches Yosef, and you really get the sense that everybody else in the room shrinks away at this moment, and it is the meeting of two of the most powerful men possible confronting each other. And Yehuda, of course, begins with a very impassioned plea on behalf of himself and his brothers. Now, at this point, Yehuda is already suspicious a little bit. The story is not making sense to him so much. Things are not adding up perfectly the way this whole thing has laid itself out, and therefore he now becomes ready to do battle because he senses a bit of an injustice. But before we look at some of the specifics of this, let's consider exactly what was occurring here. This encounter between Yehuda and Yosef is between two kings. It's also alluded to, by the way, in this week's Haftorah. In this week's Haftorah, which speaks of the division of the Malchus, of the kingship, after Shlomo HaMelech's death. Right, what happens is, of course, David passes the Malchus to Shlomo. Shlomo now passes the Malchus to his son Rechavam. But Rechavam only becomes the Melech Yehuda, the king of Yehuda, which is comprised of the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin. Of course, we understand that Yehuda stepped up to the plate on behalf of Binyamin, both to his father Yaakov by guaranteeing his return, as well as now to plea on Binyamin's behalf. And that was the continuation of Beis David. Shlomo HaMelech gives it to Rechavam, and thereafter, that is the line of Beis David, of the Malchus of David, where the real house of royalty comes from. But as I mentioned, there was a split in the kingdom, and the 10 other tribes are ruled by Yeravam ben Nevat, who ends up going down in history as one of the worst people of all time. He was a choteh umachtes harabim. He not only was a sinner, but he caused the public to sin as well. And sure enough, that split becomes fatal ultimately because those 10 tribes eventually are lost. But in the meantime, there are essentially two kingdoms of Bnei Yisrael. There's the Melech Yehuda, there is Yehuda, which is the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, which is ruled over by Beis David, by the royal house of David HaMelech. And then there are the 10 other tribes who are ruled by Ephraim. Kings from the tribe of Ephraim, that is of course from Yosef, and there we see those two kingdoms are referred to in the Haftorah, which is based on the fact that we are seeing these two kings approach each other right now. Yehuda and Yosef, who ultimately become the progenitors of the two royal dynasties in Judaism. So we see that this monumental meeting foretold the future. Yosef as the viceroy, almost king of Egypt, and Yehuda, who is the leader of the brothers at this time. What's also interesting to note is that Yehuda offers himself up as a slave in place of Binyamin. Right? When he comes to Binyamin's defense, he says, please, I will be your slave. And I mean, that was a very generous offer in terms of the fact that Yehuda was as powerful of an individual as you could imagine. The Medrash speaks at length of different things that were occurring at that time, that he was able to create essentially an earthquake, Yehuda, with his strength. So he makes that offer to become a slave in place of Binyamin, and that seems to lead to Yosef breaking down finally and disclosing his identity. Now, on a surface level, of course, we understand, because he finally saw the leader of the brothers, no less, sticking his neck out for a son of Rachel, right? His full brother Binyamin, and that broke Yosef down, because Yosef did not have that same thing happen to him so many years before, and he was now happy to see that whatever rivalries that had existed at his time when he was still in the household seemed to have dissipated at this point, to the point that Yehuda is willing to give up his own freedom on behalf of Binyamin. What I find interesting about that is the fact that there are only 2 Shvatim, and now when I'm speaking of Shvatim, I mean on the individual level, the 12 sons of Yaakov, not on the tribal level, but there are only 2 Shvatim that are specifically connected to servitude or slavery. There's Yosef, who was sold into slavery, and there's Yehuda, who offers himself up as a slave in lieu of Binyamin. What's interesting about that is that we see that there seems to be a strong connection between servitude and malchus, and kingship, and leadership. And the Gemara actually tells us that leadership is a form of servitude. I imagine, which is the source for the modern day reference to a leader as a servant of the people, a civil servant, a public servant. That idea stems from the Gemara, and even further we see perhaps may stem all the way from Yehuda and Yosef. Those 2 Shvatim that are connected to slavery and servitude are the 2 that become the leaders. So it's clear that in Jewish thought, in order to be a king, to be a leader, one must be willing to be a servant. It's not like we imagine, where we think of leaders as these arrogant, highfalutin, elite people who demand and command honor and respect. It's just the opposite. As we see from our greatest leaders, Moshe, David, they were the most humble. They felt the most undeserving and wanted only to serve the people. And we saw a modern day example of that extremely recently when Rav Steinman, Zechrono Livracha, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was nifter very recently. And last week, over 500,000 people came to his levaya. I mean, that's an extraordinary number. And yet, did you know that this was a man who just wanted to sit and learn Torah all day? He shunned leadership. He did not want to become a leader. Someone was actually telling me that until he was 70 years old, nobody even came to him really as a Rav to ask Shaila, stuff like that, maybe in the base Medrash, but he was in no way a leader, a gadol, in any way, shape, or form. He was just learning Torah. Finally, at 70, I guess he could not keep the secret any longer. His greatness exuded to the point that it was insisted that he become one of the Gedolei Ador, and of course he did. And I mean, I guess it was not too late. If you're going to live till 104, there's still a lot that can be accomplished beginning at the age of 70. But we see his humility led to his leadership and his popularity. Somebody else told me in his Sava, in his will, he wrote that he did not want people naming their children after him. He said it's not forbidden, but he is saying he preferred people not do that. Why? Because he just thought of himself as a simple man. He was just a humble servant. He was not interested in any of the accolades. So we see from there that humility, servitude, those are the attributes that we look for in a leader when we speak of a leader of the Jews. So it seems that the only way to be a king is to be willing to be a servant. That is what happened with Yosef and Yehuda. But Yehuda's kingship is considered the true and everlasting one, whereas Yosef's was temporary. Right? Yosef's kings were not meant to be eternal, and of course we know, as I mentioned before, the 10 tribes were ultimately lost, so that was one of a more temporary nature. Now, why is that? So perhaps we could suggest the following. Yosef was forced into slavery. He never wanted to be a servant, right? He didn't offer himself up as a servant. He was sold into slavery against his will. And not only that, even in his servitude, he was a leader. What happens? He comes to Potiphar's house. In no time, he becomes the head of the household. Then he gets thrown into prison. In no time, he becomes the head of the prison. That was just his nature. He was a leader by instinct almost. He was not a willing servant. He wasn't a willing slave. And therefore, it could be that's why it was temporary. And he also becomes a leader in his own lifetime. As the viceroy of Egypt, he sees the fruition of that. He sees himself as the leader. Whereas Yehuda, on the other hand, he volunteers himself to be a slave in lieu of Binyamin. Okay, that's a very different thing. He understood that his act of leadership would be to offer himself up as a slave. That's a much deeper understanding. And that's a true act of leadership. He was not thrust into slavery. He was willing to take it upon himself. And this may explain the different manifestations of their kingships. Yosef was forced into servitude. He never did it willingly. Therefore, while he gets malchus, it's not eternal. Yehuda, by volunteering, ensured that his tribe's malchus would be permanent and everlasting because he showed that attribute of willingness to be a servant. Additionally, everything he does is for the future of his tribe. He is never officially made king in his lifetime, so he gets the full reward, the eternal and ultimate malchus. It's a very interesting comparison between the two of them. But now coming back to the actual story. So as we were saying, Yehuda is getting a little suspicious exactly how this whole thing is starting to break down. And there are two particular things that occurred to him. The first is, well, what's the claim here? Yosef is claiming that they are spies, that they've come to spy out the country, to see where its weaknesses are in order to prepare for some sort of attack on the country. Now, if Yosef really suspected they were spies, the punishment he's suggesting does not fit the crime. How would one deal with suspected spies? You would incarcerate them, or you would hang them. You would put them out of commission. What does Yosef do? He sends them home to get their other brother. That does not make sense, right? Just think about that. He accuses them of being spies. They say, we're not spies. We have this other brother. He's like, okay, you know what? You guys go home and get your other brother. That's not what you would do with spies. And it just doesn't make sense. And even if we could suggest that detaining Shimon, right? He holds back Shimon. He sends the rest of the brothers home. 9 guys he sends home. Shimon he keeps in prison in order for them to go retrieve Binyamin. Now, even if we could suggest that detaining Shimon may compel them to return, I'm sorry to use the example of Jonathan Pollard to disprove that theory, but I mean, thank God he's free now, but Jonathan Pollard was essentially, I'm embarrassed to say, abandoned by his own people and by the Israeli government for all of those years. I know everybody said, hard negotiations, blah, blah, blah. We understand when we really want something, we make sure it gets done. Jonathan Pollard was essentially abandoned because that's what happens with spies. And I am not, chas v'shalom, suggesting he was a spy, but we understand that when a government is told this and this person is a spy for you, you know what the government does? We don't know who that is. I don't know who that is. They just walk away from the whole thing. Right? So now, if that were the understanding, which I think we can all assume it is, Yosef's calculations would not make a lot of sense. I'm going to keep one of the spies. You guys all send him. Why would he assume they would come back and get him? They would abandon him and say, I don't know who Shimon is. I never heard of him. Right? So Yehuda is starting to say to himself, hold on a second. This story is not adding up to me. He must have realized that if Yosef thought they were really spies, he would have never let them return home. And yet he did. Now maybe, if he was so intrigued by this missing brother or this missing spy, he would have sent one of them home to get Binyamin. Okay? 9 of you guys stay. I'm going to send one guy home. You go get him. Now already we can understand that calculation. Now they may bring him back because almost the entire spy entourage is in jail in Egypt. But to send all of them home except for one so they could get that other guy didn't make sense to him. So Yehuda is already suspicious of Yosef's professed concerns. He also knows that Yosef does not think that they are common thieves, since they brought back all the money from their first trip, right? There's one of two things Yosef thinks here. Either he thinks they're spies, which Yehuda is not falling for, or he thinks that they're thieves, right? He thinks that they stole all this food and the money, etc. But if you follow the story, when they come back to Egypt with Binyamin this time, they bring back all the cash because he had given their money back to them. When they discover it, they bring all that money back plus new money to buy the new grain. Now, that's not the action of a thief. So he's also a little bit wary of this whole idea. So clearly, and think about it. So what would their move have been? Clearly, they did not bring all this cash, right? They're flashing around a lot of money here now. They didn't do that just so they could make away with Yosef's goblet, right? What's the only other thing we can say? That maybe Yosef thought they really wanted his divining cup, his goblet that they stole. But if you think about that, that seems like a very high risk for very little reward, right? They came back again. They came back with all this money just so they could scam him, so they could pull away with his chalice. It doesn't seem to make sense at all. That would not be their big move. It reminds me of a story that happened to me a number of years ago when I went to Israel. It was for my son's Hanachas Tefillin, when he was putting on Tefillin for the first time. And I traveled a few days ahead of my family, probably so I could schlep more stuff for them. And actually, it happened to have been a time where I had 3 large bags with me, and I was schlepping a lot of stuff. And I'll tell you, the first thing to know is that when you don't think you're doing anything improper, you tend not to hide your activities, right? I mean, that's just a natural thing. If you think you're doing everything okay, you're not going to be clever, we'll say. I mention that because I was coming that trip. We were going to do a special event for my son for his celebration. We had linked up with an organization, Thank Israeli Soldiers, and we were going to be coming to a base on Purim, actually. We were going to be visiting and bringing all the soldiers on different bases, Shalach Manos. And I had asked them ahead of time, listen, is there anything that the soldiers really love? Is there something that it's hard for them to get that they really love? I'd like to bring that in addition to the Shalach Manos. So I am told that they love tube socks, black tube socks for whatever reason. I guess that keeps them warm. And they love American baseball hats. More than anything else, they love American baseball hats. So I say to myself, I'm going to get them some cool baseball hats. And it happened to have been at that time, I was a season ticket holder for the Miami Heat, at a time when the Heat were a very exciting team to be associated with. And I went to my rep and I said to him, listen, I need like 100 baseball hats. I'm not going to pay retail price for this or anything like that. I said, can you go to the office there and find out there's some old baseball hats lying around that are not needed anymore, that they don't care what they are. As long as they're baseball hats and they say the Miami Heat, they'll be ecstatic. So sure enough, he was able to find me hats from like a few years before, I don't know, like first round playoff hats that meant nothing anymore. And sure enough, gets me, 80 or 100 hats. So I'm very excited. I packed my bags. I'm on my way. And I get to customs. Now, I made an error. My error was I should have been more clever as to how I was going through customs, but as I mentioned, I wasn't doing anything wrong, so I didn't think I needed to be clever. I mentioned that because I had 3 huge bags that I was taking. We had a lot of stuff to bring there. We were going to be there for a while, and one of them was filled primarily with the hats and the socks. And as I'm walking through customs, one of the guys says, "Are you with them?" I happen to be walking near a couple with a couple of little kids as well. And I have 3 bags stacked high. In other words, I have a huge target on me saying, "Please check my bags," right? If you're alone with that many bags. And I stupidly said, "No, I'm not with them." I mean, that would have been dishonest, so it wasn't stupid. But nonetheless, I guess if I would have said yes, they wouldn't have even bothered me because they would have assumed I was part of that entourage. But instead, I said, "No, I'm alone." So they said, "Oh, okay, great. Put your bags through that thing." So I'm like, okay, I'm not fearing anything here. I have only legitimate goods. And I put it through, and then very, very nasty head guy of customs is over there. Says, "Open it up." Starts opening it up. Tells this other guy who's working for him, start taking it out. They start taking out the baseball hats and the socks, and they take a garbage bag and they start putting them in a bag. And I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what are you doing?" And he said, "What? You're not allowed to bring these in the country." I said, "Why not?" They said, "It's customs, you didn't declare them." I said, "Declare what? What do you think I should be declaring?" And they're like, "Well, these are goods for, I guess, sale or whatever." I'm like, hold on a second. Do you know why I have 3 bags? Because I happen to have flown business class. Let me ask you something. You think my big move was to bring 100 baseball hats to Israel? This was my big move to make money? How much do you think I could make on a baseball hat? $2? $3? Do you think this was my move? If I had 100 iPhones, I understand. Something like that would make perfect sense. But you think I went through all this trouble so I could bring 100 baseball hats into the country to make $200. Now, the guy was embarrassed at this point because he realized he had made a huge error. I'll just tell you the end of the story. My purpose in telling you this story, of course, is the fact that that would be such a high risk for such a small reward to go through all of that so I could have that small angle. And that's precisely what Yehuda realized. He realized there's no way Yosef thinks we went through this whole trip, we went business class, we brought all this cash just so we could sneak away with his chalice. That's really doesn't make any sense. As a PS to the story, what ended up happening is that at that point I started arguing with the guy, and the other guy is sheepishly putting it away, and they start to realize they've made a terrible mistake, right? I'm telling him, "Listen, I'm bringing this for soldiers, and that's why I have them." And I'm like, "Okay, I'm going to let them know that they had all this stuff coming, but you stopped me at the customs." He said, "You don't have the paperwork." I said, "You know what? I do have paperwork." And I go into my suitcase. I also had like 500 cards that were made by little kids. We had them for the month before. Letters to the soldiers, cards to the soldiers. I took it out and I just spread them all out on the table. I said, "You know what? Here's my paperwork. This is my paperwork to show you. I'm bringing this all for soldiers. I'm not bringing this for myself." Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, our brethren in Israel, sometimes their egos do not let them extricate themselves from situations even when they know they're absolutely wrong. He stuck hard to his position. The guy who was putting away, I saw he was turning red. He was so embarrassed. And just as a PS, this is how in Israel, you don't know your constitutional rights like you do in America. In America, I feel very secure. In Israel, not as much. So I said to the guy, as they're essentially stealing all this stuff from me, I took out my phone. I said, "Do you mind if I'm going to take a picture of you, so when the soldiers ask me where the hats are, I'm going to show them who has the hats." He goes, "You take a picture of me, I'm going to throw you in jail." And I'm like, "Okay, no picture." So, I didn't quite know what I was allowed to do there. But nonetheless, I digress. The point of that is that it made absolutely no sense to Yehuda. This whole story was breaking down in front of his eyes. He knew that Yosef could not possibly have believed that they were really spies, because otherwise he would not have done that which we discussed, where he let them all go back. And he also could not possibly have thought them to be thieves, because they never would have made that maneuver and then brought back the money just so they could steal his goblet. So Yehuda is very suspicious at this point. But perhaps, thought Yehuda, as suspicious as I am of his true intentions, he may possibly think, okay, let's say, okay, maybe he thinks we are just divining lovers, and his divining cup is something we want so badly. But something else did not make sense to Yehuda. And that is what empowered him to stand up to Yosef. And that may be what finally forced Yosef to reveal his identity. If we turn to the end of last week's Parsha, there's a revealing Rashi, and we're going to do that in a minute. But before we get to it, we will see that this may be the beginning of a theme which speaks to the precision of all events in Hashem's master plan. We are not tuned in enough to appreciate that. So we often see unfairness when there is in fact perfect justice. But ultimately we will see that for those on the level of the Shvatim, they had perfect clarity. And these events specifically occur to teach us the precision of the measurements and calculations that make up what we call Hashgacha Pratis. God's specific, divine, customized plans for each and every one of us. There's a story told about the Ibn Ezra, the great Torah commentator who was an early Rishon. He's a contemporary of Rashi and Rambam. Two men come to him complaining about their troubles and the seeming unfairness with which life seemed to be proceeding. So the Ibn Ezra told them the following story. There were two men traveling on the road, Reuven and Shimon. I'm sorry to use those names when we're talking about the Shvatim, but I mean, that's the classic way you tell them in Jewish stories. So Reuven and Shimon are traveling on the road. And Reuven had 3 loaves of bread with him, and Shimon had 2. They meet up with a third man, Levi, and he joins them and asks them if he can partake in their food. So they share their bread with him. And at the end, he says to them, here's 5 gold coins, split it among yourselves based on however you see it's fair. So the man with the 3 loaves says he wants 3 of the coins since he had 3 of the 5 loaves that they had eaten. The other man says that they should share evenly, 2.5 each. They should split it. Why? Because you gave all you had, he gave all he had, we contributed together, and we all had a meal, so I should split it with you. They come to a Rav, and the Rav declared that Reuven should get 4 coins, and Shimon should only get 1. So the men who were with Ibn Ezra hearing this story disputed the ruling and said, that makes no sense. If the first guy only claimed 3 coins, why should he get 4? Maybe you could say they can split it half and half, maybe 3 and 2, but 4 and 1, that makes no sense whatsoever. The Ibn Ezra then said, you can't even understand a simple calculation, and you think you can understand God's calculations? Let me explain to you why that ruling was just. There were 5 loaves of bread, right? Total of 5 loaves of bread, and there were 3 men. So each consumed 1/3 of the total. So if they consumed 1/3 of the total, 5 loaves times 3 equals 15 portions, right? There were 15 portions, therefore 5 portions for each of them. Now if each loaf represents 3 portions, right? 3 times 5 is 15. Then the man with 3 loaves had 9 portions, and the man with 2 loaves had 6 portions. So what happened? Reuven, who had 9 portions, kept 5 for himself and put 4 into the kitty. Shimon, who had 2 loaves, that was 6 portions, kept 5 for himself and put 1 into the kitty. So we see that the man with 9 portions ate 5 and gave 4. The man with 6 portions ate 5 and gave 1. And therefore, Reuven, who had the 3 loaves, deserves 4 out of the 5 coins. Now, most people's initial reaction to that story, of course, is to say that the first man, like those men who argued with Ibn Ezra, should get 3. And some people say 2.5. Nobody says 4 because you really need to know some clever math calculating in order to come up to that conclusion. Said the Ibn Ezra, such a simple calculation, and you did not understand it. How do you expect to understand the calculations of heaven? And that is a story for us, certainly for me. That applies to us. But for the Shvatim, however, they were much more in tune with heavenly calculations. And that is what led Yehuda to realize something was amiss and empowered him to stand up to Yosef and make Yosef realize that the jig was up. Now back to that Rashi in last week's Parsha, which will elucidate it for us. On page 248, Pasuk 16, this is right when they've been caught red-handed, so to speak. And the Pasuk says, Vayomer Yehuda, ma namar la'adoni, ma nedaber ma nitzadak, Elohim matzah es avon avadecha, hinenu avadim la'adoni, gam anachnu, gam asher nimtza ha'gavia biyadav. So Yehuda said, what can we say to my Lord? How can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has uncovered the sin of your servants. Okay, be very careful. The first part of the pasuk, it says Adoni, not God's name. Adoni means my Lord. The second part of the pasuk says Ha-Elokim. That means God, as in God. God has uncovered the sin of your servants. Here we are, we're ready to be slaves, us and the one in whose goblet was found. So what does Rashi say on that? Ha-Elokim matzah. God has uncovered the sin. Yodimanu shelo sarchenu, aval me'es hamakom haisalavi lanuzos. We know we're innocent. We haven't done anything wrong. But it is from God. God has brought this matter onto us. Matzah balchov makom legabo shtar chovo. The creditor has found an opportunity to collect on his promissory note. It's a very powerful statement. What is he saying? In other words, Yehuda was not admitting guilt, right? He's saying, I know we didn't do anything wrong here, but there's a different problem. You see, he was not admitting guilt because he knew Binyamin was innocent of the crime that he was charged with. But it was a statement of acknowledgement that despite their innocence, Hashem is justified in bringing this punishment upon them. Why? Because he wants to punish us for an earlier sin that we committed and that we know we committed. It's amazing. When we have challenges, especially ones that seem unjustified to us, we of course only look at them in their immediate context. If we are accused falsely of something, we are indignant. After all, it's not fair. I'm innocent. I'm being accused of something I did not do. We don't stop to think for a moment that this challenge has nothing to do with our current situation, but rather it may be our creditor collecting on an earlier debt. If we would do that, we would realize that the calculations are perfect and precise. Yehuda understood this, and therefore he saw no incongruity in becoming a slave based on a false accusation of theft, since he realized that they deserved this for having sold Yosef as a slave so many years before. It was not a problem for Yehuda. Yes, I'm innocent of this charge, but still it makes perfect sense to me to become a slave because the creditor is collecting on his promissory note. We know we're guilty for something previously. And that is precisely why he offers all of them up as slaves to Yosef, because he understands this is the moment that our Creator is collecting, and therefore we have to accept this judgment. But when Yosef replies that it would be unjust to enslave all of them, since the goblet was only found in Binyamin's possession, and therefore only he would be taken as a slave, Yehuda smells a rat. Now something doesn't add up. Now he knows this is not Hashem's doing, since that would truly be unjust. Since if there was one person who definitely did not deserve repercussions from the sale of Yosef, it was Binyamin. He had nothing to do with it whatsoever. So when Yehuda sees that the person being enslaved over a false accusation was Binyamin, he knew it was completely unjust, because he knew Binyamin did not steal the cup, and he knew Binyamin had nothing to do with the sale of Yosef. Once those two components come together, now that gives Yehuda the strength at the beginning of this Parsha to approach Yosef. Now Yehuda no longer has what he calls exposure to the fact that maybe Hashem is collecting on an old debt, because this can't be the collection of an old debt. This is a truly unjust thing. Once he sees it's truly unjust, that gives him the strength now to approach even the most powerful man in the world and to argue for their freedom. And Yosef may have now realized that this newfound strength of Yehuda's was because he had finally figured something was not right, thus forcing Yosef to finally disclose his identity. And that is a very deep lesson for all of us. Once we start delving into God's calculations, let's make sure we have all the numbers in front of us. Now, I don't think we'll have enough time to go over the rest of the Parsha, so let's just delve into a couple of more thoughts from the Parsha regarding the precision of the master plan and its calculations. So we know that Yosef's famous rebuke of his brothers after he disclosed, or simultaneously by disclosing his identity, is contained in his simple and eloquent statement, Ani Yosef ha'od Abi Chai. I'm Yosef. Is our father still alive? Is my father still alive? That's it. Nothing else. No yelling, no scolding, just a simple declaration. And at that moment, everyone had clarity. Everything that had occurred up until that moment made perfect sense. Let me just briefly read you an article that appeared in the paper a few years ago that I found to be fascinating. When 15-year-old Rachel Yoder was found gravely injured near her horse-drawn buggy in northeastern Ohio's Amish country, investigators at first thought she had suffered a tragic fall. Then they saw the bullet hole. Now, after a 4-day investigation, they said they believe she may have been shot in a bizarre accident caused by a rifle fired a mile and a half away. A mile and a half. The girl, who was heading home alone Thursday from a Christmas party at an Amish produce farm, died the next day. As word spread through the tight-knit Amish community not far from Cleveland, one man's family began to suffer an agonizing worry. He had been cleaning his muzzle-loading rifle that night, and he fired it into the air around the time that Rachel was shot. Could that random shot have killed her? The family went to the Holmes County Sheriff's Department, and the investigation took a turn. The more information that got out within the community, the more they came to the realization that this may have been what caused her death. Ballistics experts from the state crime are investigating. One guy didn't believe it. He said for a bullet to kill someone traveling a mile and a half is a practical impossibility. But there have been many incidents in the military when bullets have gone that distance and killed someone, he said. But it's not likely to happen if it is not intentional. It would require someone taking careful aim and making sure the firearm is steady, he said. A bullet going that far would seem to lose its velocity and direction. Fritz, a hunter, believes the mile-and-a-half theory is credible. He notes that boxes of some bullets bear a warning that they are unsafe up to a mile and a half away. Yoder's family could not be reached. They are devastated, etc., by the fact that they caused her death accidentally. When you hear that story, you say, whoa, right? That's hard to believe, but it's also hard to deny. This is not something that happened a few thousand years ago. This is something that happened recently. It seems impossible, and yet it seems to have occurred. Clearly, it shows that that bullet was intended to kill that girl. And if it needed to travel a mile and a half for that to happen, then that's what would happen. On a much larger scale, such was the reaction of the brothers. When they saw Yosef standing there, they flashed back to all those events that led up to this moment. Even more unlikely than a journey than the bullet took for a mile and a half. And they said, whoa, it all makes sense now. Now everything is clear. The second Yosef disclosed his identity, nothing more needed to be said. They all understood from moment one that all of this had been leading up to this very moment. But they were still worried because they were chosen as vehicles of suffering, even if it was part of the master plan for the good. And we, just as an aside, never want to be a vessel for something bad happening to something else, right? Hashem uses good people to be vessels for good things, and not as good people to be vessels for not so good things. Now here, that was not the case with them because this was all good, but they still worried about the suffering that they had caused. In their minds' eyes, they had caused both Yosef and Yaakov untold suffering in order to reach this point. And that caused them consternation. Therefore, Yosef, what's amazing, Yosef needs to reassure them, right? It's just interesting. Sometimes you find yourself that, like, you could be the wounded or the victim and you're like trying to reassure the other person. But in this case, he needs to reassure them that he bore no ill will and that what they did was not anything other than being a part of God's master plan. But they better get to their father quickly because he doesn't know the news yet, and they have to ensure that he does not suffer a moment longer than he already has. Which brings us to perhaps one of the most famous symbolisms, courtesy of Rashi, that we have in all of the Torah. On page 257, Psukim 256, 257, Psukim 23 and 27, here is where Yosef now sends the agalos, the wagons. Actually, Pasuk 27 is all we need. Vaydaber elav eskol dvei Yosef asher diber aleim, vayares ha'agalos asher shalach Yosef l'sei soso, vatachi ruach Yaakov avihem. And when they related to him all the words that Yosef had spoken to him, and he saw the wagons that Yosef had sent to transport him, then the spirit of their father Yaakov was revived. So it seems that at first glance, whether it was disbelief or whether he just didn't believe them, Yaakov at first has not really absorbed this news until he sees the agalot, the wagons that Yosef sent, and then his spirit was revived. So why is that? Of course, we know Rashi famously tells us that the reason why he sent agalot, which is wagons, it's a play on words, because the last subject that Yosef and Yaakov had learned when Yaakov escorted him on the way to his fateful mission to check on his brothers was the sugya, the topic of Egla Arufa, the decapitated the calf, the decapitated calf, which we'll discuss in a minute what that is, but that was the last subject they were studying. Therefore, he sent agalot. Ayin Gimel Lamed is the root word of agalot, similar to Egla Arufa, the decapitated calf. Therefore, it was some code. Hey, it's really me, Yosef, and the way I can prove it to you is by this subtle message. That's what we were learning. The laws of Egla Arufa very quickly and simply are that in the event a guest of a town is found dead on a road, what we'll call an uninhabited road, that is in between two cities, the Zakanim come out, they measure which city the deceased is closer to, and the leaders of that city go through this whole process called Egla Arufa. They hack off the neck of the calf, they decapitate him, and they declare that we did not shed any blood, we are not the ones that killed this person. Very famous Gemara, it asks, is it possible that we would think that the Chachamim, the leaders of the towns, were the ones that killed this person, but rather they tell us that they do not bear responsibility for his death. Why? Because they have to be able to declare that they gave him food and drink and escorted him along the way. And from there we learn the halacha that you must escort your guest on the way onto his journey. That offers him protection. You have to do at least Dalet Amos, in those days probably more. They would escort him for a while on his uninhabited, in his journey in an uninhabited area. And therefore they would say, we do not bear responsibility because we escorted him. And if you escort somebody, it will protect him on his journey. So Yaakov had escorted Yosef on his way to Shechem. And he taught him this halacha. And that's why he was escorting him and teaching him this halacha at the same time. Same idea. He was telling him, I'm escorting you because this will provide you protection because of the halacha of Egla Arufa, so on and so forth. Now this whole episode, besides the obvious, also caused Yaakov great grief because he could not understand how Yosef could have been harmed if he had escorted him. It gave him great consternation. It was a very big deal for Yaakov. He thought he did the proper thing. That's why when he sees the agalos, it revives his spirit. Now he saw in Yosef sending the wagons not only a symbol of what they had been learning, but its practical application as well. For indeed, Yosef had been protected. And that was why Yaakov was elated. It confirmed that which he knew to be true. Perhaps he had harbored guilt all these years that he should never have sent Yosef on that mission to check on his brothers. Although it seemed to be a questionable decision for him to send Yosef in what was perhaps a dangerous situation, and hopefully I think we're going to spend some time next week looking more deeply into that particular aspect. But Yaakov fully believed Yosef was protected due to the halacha that if he would escort Yosef, then Yosef would be protected from harm. This was very difficult for Yaakov to understand. Yosef's disappearance not only was tragic in its own right, it also challenged Yaakov's belief in something he knew to be absolutely true. That if the Torah says the person journeying will be protected, then he will be protected. End of story. So the episode of Yosef was not only an emotional, personal one for Yaakov, it also became a crisis of faith. He still believed, but the facts seemed to be irrefutable. Now he was met with a double dose of joy. Any doubts he had were clarified, and his reunion with Yosef was truly complete. Chazal have a saying, Ein simcha ka'toras hasfekos. There is no greater joy than the clearing up of doubt. When we have doubt and then things become clear, that is the greatest joy of all. Thus Yaakov's joy was compounded. He was informed that his beloved Yosef was alive, and he had confirmation regarding the efficacy and accuracy of the halacha. In other words, for Yaakov, all of God's calculations finally added up. Good Shabbos.